a psychology professor at Union College in Schenectady, New York, and I am also co-director of the neuroscience program here. Psychology and neuroscience are two of the biggest majors at Union College. And before I became a professor here, for a long time, I was a research associate and a lecturer at Harvard University, and I got my PhD in psychology there before that. My background before psychology was actually in computer science. I was an undergraduate computer science major, and I kind of moved from computer science into psychology. So oddly enough, I'm a psychology professor, and I only ever took 5 psychology courses as an undergraduate. Never took introductory psychology, never took abnormal psychology, never took social psychology, but tried to catch up. Tried to catch up a little later on.
No clinicals, huh?
No. No, I took all the psychology courses I took were cognitive psychology, neural networks, sort of all the cognitive and computer-oriented stuff, and I really sort of got into the field sideways like that because of my interest in things like artificial intelligence and computer programming, computer chess, and so on. I was a graduate student in Steve Koslin's lab at Harvard, and he took a year sabbatical in Paris, I think. And at that same year, Dan Simons came in as a new faculty member. He was an assistant professor in his first year, and his office happened to be around the corner. And I happened to know him a very little bit already because I had met him on his visit when he came to interview for the position. I was one of the graduate students who met him. And I also knew his brother. Coincidentally, his brother was a chess player, and I was a chess player. We knew each other because we had both been playing chess at Harvard before. So Dan and I sort of started talking and got into collaborating. And part of the way we did that was through me being the teaching fellow, that's what we called them then at Harvard, teaching fellows, for his course on doing cognitive psychology experiments for undergraduates. And it was there that we sort of got first started on this research that eventually led to our book and everything else.
What's the origin story of the gorilla? Like, how do you come up with the idea to have a gorilla walk in the middle of a group of kids playing basketball?
Well, so Dan Simons, when he was teaching this course, wanted to have some projects that the whole class could do as a group. And all the psychology research I had done up until then was basically testing individual people in rooms with computers. We were very oriented towards sort of simple visual displays and measuring people's reaction times, how fast they would press keys in response to these displays and so on. Dan wanted to do something a little different. He came from a different tradition at Cornell, and he had the idea of recreating and updating Ulrich Neisser's research from the 1970s on what Neisser called selective looking, which was sort of a phrase that went out of style. But Neisser had done this experiment where he had a woman carrying an umbrella walk through a bunch of people throwing basketballs around. And actually it was 3 people throwing basketballs, but he overlaid 2 videos of the same three people throwing basketballs, and then he overlaid a video of this woman with an umbrella. And they all looked like ghosts because he used some technique with mirrors to basically make these 3 overlays. This was the 1970s when you couldn't just shoot digital video and make them transparent and everything that is easy to do now. So Dan knew about this research. I actually didn't even know about it at the time. And Dan suggested that we do that kind of thing as a group project, but with a bunch of students in our class, everybody could be in the same place at the same time. We didn't need to overlay a bunch of ghosts the way Neisser did. So we actually filmed it that way with the people all interacting together. There wasn't any plan to use a gorilla suit from the outset, as far as I know. In fact, we were going to do it just with the woman with an umbrella, which we actually wound up doing. But one of the students who was working on the project, one of the grad students named Steve Most, also worked with Jerry Kagan, who was a developmental psychologist, famous developmental psychologist, who did studies of temperament in infants. And he had all kinds of stuff in his lab that he would use to sort of elicit different reactions and set up different scenarios to see how the infants and children would react. And one of them was a gorilla suit that he had. I guess he had research assistants where, yeah, exactly, yeah,
baby gorilla suit. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, a gorilla suit could be a little bit scary, and I think that was part of the point. And Steve went and borrowed the gorilla suit. I don't know under exactly what circumstances it was borrowed, but it was borrowed long enough for us to use in shooting the videos. And we spent a whole class period, which was I think about an hour and a half, filming all kinds of different versions of this thing. And towards the end, we still had time left, and we had filmed everything we needed to film. Dan was behind the camera, sort of. He was the video guy. He knew how to do video editing and so on. I was more sort of choreographing and directing, making sure people go to the right place and so on. And we had some time left, so we just started doing funny things. And one of the funny things was the gorilla came in and turned to face the camera and thumped its chest. And we just sort of made these videos kind of for fun at the end. But once we had run our main experiment, we had all the students go out and collect the data. And once we had run the main experiment, which just involved the gorilla walking straight through and the umbrella woman walking straight through and leaving, once we had finished that main experiment, we realized, why not just try and see what would happen if we used the thumping video? And in our small sample, nobody... no more people noticed the thumping gorilla than had noticed the gorilla just walking through. It was basically the same result, and yet the event was 9 seconds long, this gorilla walking through and thumping its chest. So since that was much funnier than all the other versions, we wound up using that for class demonstrations, and Dan put it on a DVD that people could then buy and use for their own demonstrations and so on. But the only reason there's a gorilla in there that I know of is that there just happened to be a gorilla suit lying around. If it had been a rabbit suit, or it would have been different, or a clown suit or something. Yes, things would have been different if there had been different costumes in someone else's lab. That's how it happened.
Why is this? Why don't we see the gorilla?
The reason why we don't see things like the gorilla or the umbrella woman or other important things that we sort of intuitively think we should see is that attention turns out to work by not just enhancing the information processing of what we're paying attention to. Attention enables us to do things like track balls flying around. Without attention, we couldn't really, get any appreciation out of sports. It would just seem like a big blur of things happening all at once. But the fact that we can track the ball and track the players and so on requires attention and enables us to do all kinds of fancier things with our visual system than we could without attention, but it seems to sort of take processing resources away from other things. So to increase processing of something, it turns out you've got to really decrease processing of something else more than we actually realized. And when you decrease processing of that other thing, the processing can be so shallow that you have no actual perception of it, or at the least no ability to recall it or even know that you saw it. So there are many real-world examples of this kind of inattentional blindness. One famous one happened to Ben Roethlisberger, the Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback, who liked to drive his motorcycle around in Pittsburgh. And apparently he was at an intersection, and there was a woman driving a car in the another lane. And he said afterwards that he looked right at her, saw that she looked at him, and yet when he continued through the light, she collided directly with him, as though she had no idea that he was there, and as though she had never seen him. And it seems very odd to our intuition that you could look right at something and yet not register it. But if you go back to the invisible gorilla experiment, a sports psychologist in Germany named Daniel Memmert actually ran the study showing people the video while using an eye tracking device to record exactly where their eyes fixated on the screen as they were watching it, and found that on average people looked at the gorilla for about a second even if they didn't see it. So easily Roethlisberger could have been right about what this woman was doing. She could have actually looked at him and yet still not seen him, probably because her attention was directed somewhere else. We may not know. It's hard to go back forensically and say, did someone really not see you? Or did they see you and decide to drive anyhow? That seems sort of unlikely and so on. But there's really no sort of going back and proving it. We just know that this kind of occurrence is much more common than we realize.
She was a Cleveland fan.
Well, exactly. So if you see that the enemy quarterback is on a motorcycle nearby and you're a really vicious fan, you may aim for exactly. You might aim for him, but that's I guess that we need other investigative techniques to figure out whether that's what happened. There's all kinds of stuff we don't notice in the world, and I think at some level we're aware of that. We know that what's happening in the next room over is something that we don't know, we don't perceive. There's no way we could form a memory of it or whatever. It's happening behind a closed door. But what we, I think, get wrong is that we think that things that are happening in front of us or in the same room as us, or things that are happening while we're around, are things that we would remember more than we really should. I think we just tend to think that the scope of our attention is broader and more diffuse than it really is. Whereas in reality, whenever we have some task or something we're trying to accomplish, attention to other things besides that decreases more than we know. There's a famous task used in judgment and decision-making research where you give a passage of text and you ask people to simply count the number of times the letter F appears in the passage. And when I use this in my classes, which I do all the time, I use the First Amendment to the Constitution because it's got a lot of the word "of" in it, freedom of the press or of religion and so on. And I think the reason why I started using it was the very first day that I taught that material happened to be Constitution Day or something like that. And there was some advice that sort of like all teachers in the country are supposed to incorporate something about the Constitution. And I said, well, I'm teaching cognitive psychology. How am I going to do that? So I grabbed the First Amendment and used that passage. And the passage I use has about 10 instances of the letter F in it. But often students only notice 5, 6, or 7 of them, and almost nobody catches all 10. Maybe 2 out of 30 students will count all 10 letter Fs. And of course, the one that they miss a lot of the time are the ofs, the F in the word of. And so I always have them go through what are the reasons for that. I think part of it is attention, part of it is how you direct your attention, but a lot of it also has to do with a broader phenomenon of constructive perception, right? So constructive perception means that how you perceive the world is not just a pure sort of bottom-up process where all the photons that hit your retina get processed equally and so on. At some level they do, but even at the level of the retina at the back of the eye, you're starting to you're starting to modify the incoming information and start to do things that help you extract meaning from it. And the number of times the letter F appears in a passage is just not something that the brain ever has a goal of figuring out, except in this very specialized circumstance. Instead, the goal is to read it. So reading little words like of, which has a paradoxical pronunciation too, it sounds like OV instead of OF. So counting those as single units and not breaking them down into their components or not paying attention to the individual letters makes a lot of sense. In that passage I use, there's First Amendment and freedom and those things. The F stands out much more because it's the first letter, it's sort of pronounced. So it does involve sort of directing attention, but also just sort of constructing a mental representation of the input that doesn't need to know, doesn't care how many letter Fs there are or anything like that. And going back and sort of breaking it down into its individual components is kind of like breaking the screen down into pixels. We don't see the screen as a bunch of pixels. Nor do we see a passage of text as a bunch of letters, actually, it turns out. So besides the illusion of attention, which is the idea that we pay attention to and notice more of the world than we actually do, it's a mistaken belief. That's why we call it an illusion of attention. There's also the illusion of memory, which is the idea that our memories are more objective, permanent, detailed, and accurate than they actually are. There's the illusion of confidence, which has 2 parts, one of which is our excessive confidence in our own skills and abilities. So we generally think our skills are higher than they actually are. And then we also pay too much attention to the confidence that other people express. So we put too much stock in how confident someone is, and we don't discount for the fact that people tend to be overconfident. Then we have the illusion of knowledge, which we talk about, which is the idea that we know more about particular topics than we really do, or that our knowledge is deeper than it actually is. Then the illusion of cause, which is our mistaken belief that we understand cause and effect better than we really do. We often sort of infer cause and effect in the world on the basis of information that sort of can't logically, prove cause and effect. And then finally, the illusion of potential, which is the idea that there are sort of hidden reservoirs of potential inside our brains that are easy to unlock and access. So that's in contrast to the idea that we have the potential to become great at something if only we practice for a long time.
10,000 hours.
Right. Well, 10,000 hours or a few thousand hours or at least some kind of hard effort, right? The illusion of potential is the idea that there are sort of, easy, fun, pleasurable, short things that we can do that will dramatically increase our brain power or other capacities. There's no way that I know of to prove that someone is having an innocent false memory as opposed to a lie, because only they know in their own mind whether they're deliberately lying or not. But there's a lot more false memory going on than I think we realize. And one reason I say that is that when the Brian Williams incident happened, and when the Hillary Clinton incident happened, almost nobody in the media that I noticed offered the explanation of memory distortion. There are a lot of people saying, they're lying, they're demented, they're evil, they're psychotic. Depending on where you are politically, you can pick your favorite one of those, of those arguments. But almost nobody was talking about memory distortion. Yet we know from laboratory experiments how easy it is to cause people to have false memories. Just getting people to repeat a false story a few times over a period of a couple of visits to the lab can cause some significant percentage of those people to incorporate it into their own memories. There are also very elegant studies, laboratory studies, of how people's memories for events they actually did experience change over time. So, for example, in 1986, the Challenger space shuttle blew up. Some clever psychologist, including Ulrich Neisser, had people write down the circumstances of how they learned about that right afterwards, and then came back to them a year or two later and asked them to remember how they heard about the Space Shuttle Challenger blowing up. And then we're able to compare sort of the actual facts about how they heard about it, who told them where they were, what their reaction was, to what they remembered a couple of years later. And there were incredible distortions in these memories. And for most people, that was a highly significant emotional event. It was tied up with national identity, national pride, teachers flying into space and so on. And yet those memories were just as distorted as any other kind of memory. So when we do have the opportunity to compare real facts with memories, when there isn't a motive for distorting, when they're not lying to, clearly not lying to get ahead deliberately, and they're surprised at it, we see lots of distortion. So what I take from that is that when we see a case where there's just, a distorted memory, like with Brian Williams or with Hillary Clinton or with Bill O'Reilly or with other, well-known people who have done these things, we should think about the possibility that it's just an ordinary memory distortion and not that they are lying because of some motive to deceive or pump up their own reputation. They could be, but we don't really, we don't really know. And the memory distortion explanation seems a lot more possible than most people realize. Well, I think we have to take them as memories, right? I mean, fortunately, they're called memoirs, which does give us a little hint, right? But that's a little different from biography. Like my impression has always been that when someone calls something a memoir, they're basically telling you, this is how I remember it. And hopefully they're not deliberately embellishing. Hopefully when they do make mistakes, which are probably very common in memoirs, mostly mistakes we'll never know about because there aren't any other sources that we could go to corroborate. But we should just assume that they're full of mistakes. And these mistakes might not necessarily just be trivial details like thinking something happened in 1982 when it really happened in 1981. There could be entire events in memoirs that never happened to the people that wrote them down, but they honestly believe that they did. It's some people find this kind of depressing that memory is, that memory turns out to be much less accurate than we think it is. But I think we have to come to grips with it and try to find ways to sort of be more evidence based when it comes to the past and not not assume that memory is as accurate as people think it is.
Or be more forgiving.
Well, of course, we should also be more forgiving, right? When someone writes a memoir and it turns out they wrote something that wasn't true, there could be, I no doubt there are people who are deliberately, lying to exaggerate, but I think there's a lot more inadvertent memory distortion. Those memory distortions may say something about the character of the people who are distorting their own memories. If people's memories have them constantly being at the center of the danger and, running towards, important events and hanging out with famous people and so on, when in fact they didn't, that may tell you something about how they see themselves, right? It might not tell you anything about their cognitive health, because everybody distorts, memories, whether your brain is working fine or not, but it could tell you something really important about their self-image, that they see themselves as being a really important person or a more important person or consequential person than they actually are. What made me think about how confidence works in everyday life was something that happened to me in graduate school. At least I think I was in graduate school at the time. I know it was in the summer. It felt very warm in my apartment then, and I had these flu symptoms for a few days, and it was really bad. I didn't want to get out of bed. When I did, and I went to sit down, then I just sort of didn't want to get up and walk around even. And after a few days of this, I took a shower, and I saw in the shower that I had this big, funny-looking bullseye rash on the back of my leg. And I had some idea what it was. I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't anything that I'd ever seen there before. And I went straight over to the health services. And this was a weekend day. I remember they sort of had a skeleton crew there, but there was one doctor there covering the weekend health services at Harvard. And she took a look at it and so on. And the interesting part of the encounter was that she left the room and she came back and had a book with her. And she opened up the book and showed me a photograph of what was in the book. And it was a rash that looked very much like mine, and it was characteristic of Lyme disease. So that's where the tick bites you and the Lyme disease bacteria gets into your body and it forms this characteristic rash. It doesn't happen to everybody who has Lyme disease, but it happens in a lot of cases, and it's very diagnostic. And she said, it looks like you have Lyme disease. And I said, what's the treatment? And the next thing she did was she looked up the treatment in some other book, which basically tells you what antibiotic to prescribe for how many days and so on. And she did exactly what the book said, as far as I know. And I had never been in a medical encounter where the doctor actually stopped to look things up and showed me what they were looking up. And reflecting back on it later, after I took all the antibiotics and was completely cured and haven't had any symptoms since then, reflecting back on it later, I realized that doctors consulting other sources is kind of unusual. Usually doctors just tell you, here's the diagnosis, here's what I want you to do. It just all comes right out of their head, and they say it very confidently. And we pay a lot of attention to the confidence of other people. And in this case, it was sort of one of the most underconfident, medical encounters I could imagine. They're looking stuff up right in front of you and showing you that they don't have it in their head, and they're showing you that they have to look it up in this reference material. I have no idea who this doctor was, why she did that, what the point of it all was, but it made me appreciate that we have this illusion that when people say things quickly and confidently and so on, they may not always be right. Yet we tend to interpret fast, fluent, confident responses as being correct and as being indicators of skill. And if you think about some people who have built their TV careers on this kind of thing, think about Jim Cramer, who does this show on CNBC, investing advice show. I think it's called Mad Money, where basically people call in and say, what do you think about GE stock? And he'll immediately rattle off like 3 facts about GE, and then he'll say buy or sell. And he's even got like this sound effect that screams buy, sell, buy. It's the whole show is based on sort of an expression of confidence and speed about something. And he's got people who invest based on this advice and so on. And it's all, I think, part of the illusion of confidence. Obviously, he knows a lot about finance and so on, but the way it's presented here is to sort of maximize that illusion of confidence.
When's the last time you've heard a politician say, I don't know?
Right. I don't know is one of the rare things you'll ever hear in politics, or even in teaching. We often tend to say it not as much as we should. It's hard for a professor in front of a class to admit they don't know the answer to something, because the whole situation is set up with an authority figure and a bunch of people who have less knowledge. And if the person up here, if the person in the front starts admitting they don't know things, or they're not sure, they have to look it up and so on, that in a way can dispel that illusion. There is research that shows that people, perceive doctors who sort of dress more authoritatively as being more authoritative and knowledgeable, right? Sort of like white coat versus not, wearing a tie or something like that. And there's also research that where you videotape simulated encounters between doctors and patients, and indeed people who see the doctor looking information up, have less, confidence in the doctor's ability, which is in a way paradoxical, because if you look something up, you're pretty much guaranteed to get it right, at least for whatever the standard treatment is. Whereas if it comes right out of your head, there's always a chance it's wrong. So in a way, people have the inverse, the inverse belief that they should. And I think that has something to do with the fact that our ways of perceiving people and our ways of placing our confidence and trust in people evolved over a long period of time when there were no reference works to consult. So the idea that someone's going to go and consult a reference work or look something up in a computer and so on is just not something that fits in well to our way of perceiving people's character and their intelligence and their knowledge and so on. So the illusion of knowledge happens when we think we understand something better than we do. It's not the same thing as confidence. Confidence is sort of generally has to do with our skill, whereas knowledge is more specific. So classic examples of this are when investors make huge directional bets on markets, on stocks, commodity prices, things like that, based on the idea that they know what's going to happen in the future better than the rest of the world does, or at least better than the party on the other side of the transaction. There's always at least one party on the other side of the transaction who thinks the opposite of you, or probably does. But then also there's the notion that how good can your knowledge be? Can your knowledge be so good that you're going to commit millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, on that, And it's one thing to spread out your investments along a broad portfolio. That's kind of recognizing the limitations of your knowledge, right? You're not going to invest, too much in any one claim. But there have always been cases of, let's say, commodity traders who made massive bets that the price of oil was going to go up, or the price of oil was going to go down, or some currency was going to go up or down. And of course, we hear about all the ones who succeeded with that, like George Soros, who made billions of dollars doing this. But there are also stories of people who completely blew up and failed. And we don't, we don't really find out as much about those guys, except sometimes when they make the news. And that reflects sort of, I think, a mistaken belief that we actually understand the way the world works better than we really do. So some of the interesting research that's been done on the illusion of knowledge asks participants to express how much or how well they think they understand a simple physical system like a bicycle, let's say. So researcher in the UK asked participants, on a scale of 1 to 7, how well do you understand how a bicycle works? And then the surprise question was, she actually gave them a drawing of sort of the skeleton of a bicycle and asked them to fill in the rest of the parts. So for example, the wheels would be there and the frame, and they would have to draw in the chain and a couple of other parts, and how the like handlebars connected to the front wheel or something like that. And what she found was that even among people who rated their knowledge of how bicycles work really highly, the bicycles they drew could not possibly work. So for example, the chain would connect the front wheel to the back wheel. And if you think about it for a second, if the chain in a bicycle connects the front wheel and the back wheel, every time you turn the front wheel, the chain is going to fall off, or your bicycle is going to fall over. One of the other two things. And some of these people even were people who rode a bike, to and from work or school every day. So they really looked at these things all the time. They used them. They did have some knowledge of them, but they rated their knowledge as deeper than it actually was. And there have been many other studies like this. People will say things like, they know why the sky is blue, but if you start asking probing questions, they basically stop after one answer. Their knowledge is not nearly as deep as they think it is. And this is fun in experiments when people sort of demonstrate that they draw impossible bicycles. But when it comes to important decisions made on the basis of one's knowledge, then it can be really dangerous. And I think this happens in business a lot. That in organizations kind of convince themselves at the organizational level or at the level of teams or groups within the organization that they understand the customer or the future, trends or success of products or whatever better than they actually do. I think we have this model based on companies like Apple, let's say, which sort of seems to release hit product after hit product, that it's possible to just sort of figure it all out, embody it in a product, and it works and so on. There's a lot more uncertainty than we realize, I think, and the idea that we know things better than we do is sort of a minimization of the uncertainty and the noise of the environment that we operate in. When we think about success, like the success of a company like Apple, let's say, or the success of a great investor or something like that, there are a number of cognitive biases that come into play. One is we sort of look at that company and we say, how did they become so successful? Well, if we started out with a universe of 10,000 companies, almost inevitably one of them was bound to be the biggest one, the most successful one, the most profitable one. There's got to be one, right? There's got to be a winner. So in a way, we're sort of retrospectively picking one and saying, how did they win when we're under the illusion that we were picking them from the beginning, and sort of knowing that they were going to win or something like that.
So a lot of these books and articles on the great companies and what they've done to become great are really illusions of cause.
That's exactly right. If you start with a universe of successful companies and say, what characteristics do these companies have in common, which is what a lot of business books do, or they don't even get that far. They just start with a successful company like Apple and start talking about it. They don't even compare Apple to other successful companies. You're not going to find the truth, really, because you have to first also compare to failures and see, what the failures were like also. And I suspect there are a lot of companies very much like Apple that try to do similar things that have not succeeded. Part of it is factors that I don't think luck is really the right word for it, but maybe path dependence. It sort of depends on where they started and what exactly the market was doing at the exact time that they came out with that product, and coming out with things at the right time and the wrong time. And that could be luck. It was may have been luck that Apple got into the smartphone game, a little bit later, let's say, or it may have been, some things they seem to have to be dragged into, like having apps for the iPhone or something like that, that turned out to be a huge, a huge successful business in the end. When we look backwards, right, we can't really draw lessons for going forwards. I think that's the basic, the basic conclusion. You've got to look going forward and compare the failures to the successes. And not only that, even then you have the problem of causality, right? Because whatever Apple did, even if it was different from what some other company did, it wasn't randomly assigned for Apple to do that and the other, and other companies to do the opposite. The fact that Apple did something may have something to do with other factors about their company that we're not really looking at. This happens a lot when people. Another great example of this that I wrote about recently is research on the return on investment of going to college. So this is always very popular, especially around college application season. Everybody likes to publish these tables showing, which college gives you the greatest ROI. And there are so many flaws with these. I don't even want to call them studies. They're these sort of data tables that people cook up and so on, and sort of present them as though they're doing some kind of fantastic analysis and data science or something like that. One problem is that if you look at how much money people earned who went to different colleges, they weren't randomly assigned to go to those colleges, right? So the people who went to MIT may be making more money than the people who went to community college, but they're not the same people. So the fact that they went to MIT is only one of many differences, among them. They might have come from wealthier families to start with. They probably had higher math SATs and greater math ability to start with. They probably knew more about computer programming before they even, got to MIT. There's thousands of things that could be driving some of that, and it's probably some combination of those thousands of things, plus the fact that they went to MIT, that explain, the difference. But if you talk about return on investment, you're hypothetically saying, well, suppose I could choose to either go to this community college or go to MIT, which should I go to? But that was not the choice that's not the choice that most people face. Most people can't get into MIT or substitute any other, top university or whatever you want to talk about.
The variables that got me into MIT are probably similar variables to what make me successful later in life. Exactly.
The things that enable you to get into MIT are things that are good ingredients for success no matter what. So the only good way to do this, there's almost no way to do this study for real, right? But causality is hard to test in the real world, because who's going to volunteer for experiment where we're going to say, let's have you apply to 20 colleges and then we'll randomly assign you to one of them or something like that. What colleges are going to let me, the experimenter, randomly determine the membership of their incoming class? It's never going to happen. But fortunately, there are researchers who have figured out very clever techniques to try to get at these things. And the best study that I know of this college ROI problem actually found people who had gotten into, let's say, again, just to pick hypothetical examples, Ohio State and Harvard. Big state school, low tuition, smaller, elite private school, high tuition. And when you have people who got into both, which there are some, and you look at the people who went, to one versus the people who went to the other, they actually don't differ in things like how much money they're making, their income later on, or other achievements, suggesting that it's sort of like being able to get into Harvard is really the important thing, not so much actually going to Harvard, at least for the variables that they measured in this study. It happens all the time, and yet the illusion of cause is attributing the difference in success to this one very salient factor. Often what we do is we sort of notice a salient factor and attribute everything to that. Part of the illusion of cause is thinking that causes are, unitary, that there's one thing that causes something else. For this chapter in our book, I actually had a research assistant go and search through the transcripts of Chris Matthews' on Hardball, his show on MSNBC, where he would interview guests about the Iraq War, and he was very fixated on asking his guests at this time what was the reason for going to war in Iraq. And he kept on asking what was the reason. And it struck me that his question sort of presupposed that there was one reason, or that there was one reason which drove everything else, as opposed to perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5 interlocking reasons that combined to result in what in retrospect might have been a bad decision, but at the time seemed reasonable, and that it wasn't just one thing that caused that, but there were lots of causes. Yes, we don't often see all the variables that might cause things. It's hard for I think our minds are not designed to sort of weigh several interacting variables. That's a skill we learn even in graduate school, when we're learning how to do data analysis and so on, is to think about the relative weights of different factors in influencing an outcome. It's just not something that comes naturally to us. Now, there are probably some ways that we behave in everyday life that sort of seem like we're doing that, but that's because these are things our minds evolved to handle. So, for example, in perception, in order to see the world as accurately as possible, the visual system takes into account a lot of different factors, like the light sources, how things are moving, the shadows, all kinds of other stuff. But that's all built into the hardware. The hardware is designed to take into account all those different factors. We don't have a general purpose hardware mechanism in our brain for multifactorial causal reasoning. It's just not something that comes naturally at all. So the illusion of cause is our tendency to think we see cause and effect or understand what causes what when we actually don't have true evidence for cause and effect. And another part of it is our tendency to think that events have one cause or decisions have one cause or reason, when in fact there are multiple factors. So people who are opposed to vaccinating their children for common diseases, right, measles, whooping cough, and so on, I think are in a way demonstrating the illusion of cause, because likely what they've heard about is the idea that vaccines might cause autism. And while there's no actual evidence that vaccines are even associated with autism across the population, it's a very compelling illusion to see or to hear of a child who received their vaccines for measles one day, and then 2 weeks later, a month later, started showing the symptoms of autism. Inevitably, there are going to be cases like that, because as long as there's autism, some kids are going to show symptoms of autism. And as long as people are being vaccinated, some kids are going to be vaccinated close to when they start showing the symptoms of autism. So our sort of built-in cause detector is going to find those examples, not look at, whether those examples would be things that would just happen, due to chance. So it's definitely an example of that kind of... The illusion of potential is the mistaken belief that inside our brains there are these sort of hidden reservoirs of untapped potential that are easy to activate by doing simple things like playing video games or listening to the right kind of music or something like that. It's
Mozart Effect.
Yes, the Mozart Effect is a classic example of the illusion of potential. The Mozart Effect is a name given to a finding in 1993. It was published in Nature, which is, by some rankings, the top science journal in the world. And what this study found was that college students who listened to about 10 minutes of a particular Mozart piano sonata subsequently did better on IQ tests given right after the music was over, as compared to students who just sat in silence or listened to sort of relaxation, calming instructions on a tape. And this was immediately dubbed the Mozart Effect, and companies started reprinting their Mozart CDs with new labels and titles and so on. Mozart makes you smarter. And I think the reason why we rush to believe this is not because, well, wouldn't it be great if it were true? All we have to do to get smarter is listen to classical music. It plays into an association we already have in our minds that classical music is the music, of wealthy, intelligent, educated people, and wouldn't we all like to be wealthy, intelligent, and educated? And also, we have this sort of intuitive belief that there is this untapped potential, and we're not surprised somehow that simple, means might unlock it, as opposed to, long, hard study in school to get better at, IQ tests or something like that. Yeah, so I think the illusion of potential also has something to do with why we're quick to believe things like we only use 10% of our brain, which is a meme that's been around for probably almost 100 years by now. Some psychologists have tried to sort of trace it back and figure out where it came from. I'm not sure they've really quite got that straight, but there's been for quite a long time a sort of current of thought that says that, through positive thinking or through getting, through getting in touch with hidden potential or something like that, we can all become more successful and wealthier, and it comes in sort of cycles of think and grow rich, power of positive thinking, the secret. I mean, it always seems to come back to sort of some simple means of vastly changing your life and improving yourself. Well, I think the idea of everyday illusions is that our intuitive beliefs about how our minds work are often inaccurate. Somehow, as human beings, we come built in with ideas about how our own minds work. It's one of the many categories of ideas that we sort of naturally have without having to be taught them. And in the case of everyday illusions, they come, I think, from our sort of introspection or our experience of how our own minds work. So we don't experience not noticing things, right? If we don't notice something, we don't notice it. We don't know that we didn't notice it. The visual experience we do have is very rich. We think we're seeing all kinds of detail, and we are, pretty good visual creatures. Likewise with memory, we often experience remembering very detailed stories, scenes, facts, and so on. We don't experience the fact that those things are distorted and changed over time in our minds. And we can go on with the other ones. So I think our experience is often so rich and fluent that it convinces us that our minds are sort of working at, higher levels than they actually are, in a lot of these cases. And this would be one thing if it was just a scientific curiosity, but unfortunately we often base decisions that are important on our beliefs about how the mind should work. So when we, convict someone on the basis of very confident eyewitness testimony, we're sort of basing that conviction and that sentence, and maybe ultimately the death penalty or something like that, on the idea that witnesses who remember things in detail and seem confident about it must be right. But that is simply, not an accurate belief. And
this is very depressing. What do we do about it?
Well, so yeah, it could be depressing to think about the limitations of the mind in this way and to think about our unawareness of the limitations of the mind. So the first way, I think, to get over it and make a change is maybe first to become more aware of them, right? So once you know about these things, you've taken the first step, right? I think that the next step is just to try to see examples of these in your own behavior or in the behavior of other people. Often it's easier to see these things happening in other people's behavior because someone will say something that you think just can't possibly be right. So break it down and figure out, why it can't be right. They can't be remembering everything that precisely. They can't be so certain about what they're saying, right? This latest quick fix, for becoming smarter, like playing fun video games on the web, can't possibly, be right. Maybe there's a small chance it is, but, the odds are that there's something being missed here, right? And we need to sort of think about it, more deeply. But then it's just, I think, even since we published our book, I feel like I've gotten better since then at noticing these things. And just to give an example, when the Brian Williams story hit the news, my first reaction was, well, it sounds like he's having a false memory. And almost nobody else that I could see, in the whole discussion said that. And I said that on Twitter. I said, sounds like an ordinary false memory to me. And a lot of people on Twitter were not happy with that, mostly because they don't like the media and so on. But it shows you how you really have to sort of, I think, learn to see these things in people's behavior and in your own behavior. And doing that might make you a little more forgiving and understanding of other people, and also might help you change your own thinking habits and your own decision-making habits to try to minimize the influence of these illusions. The other thing I'd add is that a lot of the place that these illusions come from is the fact that the environment we live in nowadays is not the same one that existed for millennia, thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years of human evolution going back to our ancestors. It's a more complex world. There's a lot going on in the world today that our brains were not really designed to handle very well. But on the other hand, we do have a lot of technologies nowadays that can help us. So if you were a newscaster, or really anyone who wants to tell stories based on their memory, at this point in time, you should be aware that memory is more fallible than you think, but you should also be aware that your own environment is collecting lots of information about your own past. So you can go and look at, your old calendar files, your old sent emails, your old saved messages, or if you're like me, just go back and look at your inbox, because my inbox still has things from 10 years ago that I never deleted. You can talk to other people. You can corroborate your own memories, and that's just an example from memory itself, where the world around us can help us overcome these illusions, at least in sort of critical situations, if we take advantage of it. So some of the work I've been involved in now, which is joint work with Tom Malone at MIT and Anita Woolley at Carnegie Mellon, is looking at the concept of collective intelligence. And the way we're looking at collective intelligence is measuring the intelligence of a team or a small group of people. So nowadays, in business, in science, in basically every kind of organization and endeavor there is, more and more important work is done by people working together as groups. Partly that's just because of the complexity of what we do is larger than it used to be. Even in science, multi-authored articles are becoming more and more the norm. And in psychology, there's a long tradition of research measuring the intelligence of individuals. It's been known for over 100 years, for example, that people who do well at one particular kind of cognitive task tend to do well at other tasks as well. So people who are good at mathematical reasoning tend to have above average vocabularies as well. Of course, the correlation is not perfect, right? We all know people who are not that great verbally, but really good at math, and people who are the opposite. But across the broad spectrum of people, they correlate positively, and that's where the concept of intelligence comes from. Someone who's smart, someone who we regard as smart, sort of generally does better in cognitive things than someone else. Well, we found in our research that this is true of teams as well. We created teams in the lab of research volunteers and had them work together on a bunch of tasks. And some teams just did better across the board than other teams did. Exactly what you find with individuals taking IQ tests, we found when teams took this kind of team IQ test that we came up with. So we would say, some teams just have higher collective intelligence than other people. Where I think it gets more interesting than that is when we look at what factors distinguish the teams with higher collective intelligence from the teams with lower collective intelligence. One of the most interesting ones we found was that teams with higher collective intelligence tend to have more women. So generally speaking, adding women, at least in our research, in our studies, having more women on a team made a team more collectively intelligent. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can sort of take any team that's operating in your organization right now and add a couple of women onto it and they'll get smarter. They might. But it does suggest a direction for exploration and something to think about. The other one is social intelligence. So the social intelligence of the individual members of the team turned out to be really important. So having people on your team who are better at decoding facial expressions, who are better at understanding other people's beliefs and emotions and what other people are thinking really seems to improve the collective intelligence of the group. And one reason for that might be that they need to spend less time communicating information about those kinds of things if they're quicker to pick it up themselves. They can spend more time more efficiently focus on solving the tasks at hand and being productive and not have to exchange that kind of information.
I might make better choices in how I engage you about a particular issue.
Sure. If you're better at knowing what I know and knowing how I'm likely to react to different things, we'll be more productive together. And that's an interesting ingredient for collective intelligence, because if it's not something we can teach people easily to do, we can certainly look, to compose teams and set the conditions for teams to work together that, make it possible for members to express, better social intelligence and to find better patterns of working together. Another pattern we found was that when the individual members of the team sort of make more equal contributions, when they each speak about the same amount of time, or when they alternate speaking well, then you get higher collective intelligence. Now, that doesn't mean you could sort of go in and impose a rule. Like at our next meeting, everyone's going to speak once, and then we're going to go around at the beginning again. That might be artificial. That might not work. But across the teams in our research studies, that was a characteristic that, that seemed to help. We haven't tested whether it's prescriptive yet, because all the studies that we've done, they do involve getting subjects into the lab and randomly creating the team. So it's not as though we're studying existing teams who succeed and comparing them to existing teams who fail, kind of like comparing Apple to some right. Some third tier company in the same industry, right? We're creating all these teams from scratch that people don't know each other. We don't have any reason to think that this won't generalize to other kinds of real world teams, but we haven't yet run the experiments where we impose a rule saying here's how you're going to communicate or something like that. And that's definitely needs to be done to see whether it generalizes. We don't want to have the illusion of cause, mess up our own research in that way. But it's this kind of research I think is good at finding hypotheses and ideas for what can be done with real teams.
Cool.
Critical thinking to me means not so much thinking critically as in being a critic or being a skeptic. Or being someone who inherently tends to disbelieve things or just criticize things. It means careful thinking, right? So it doesn't mean always complaining about scientific studies or always complaining about what people say and so on. It means thinking more carefully about what evidence is, how we weigh evidence, what the right way of doing experiments or doing studies that could possibly give us information that would be really meaningful would be. I often, hear people talk about critical thinking, and I always worry a little bit that it's teaching people to be critical, right? And that's not, I think, what it's supposed to be about. It should be teaching people to think logically and carefully and scientifically. That's what I think critical thinking really is.